Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. Throughout our conversations on this podcast, we continue to reflect on what feels outdated and what feels like our way forward in terms of masculine norms. I don't know about you, but I can tend to feel disheartened when I look out into the world and continuously see the unsustainable impacts of more rigid and power-based forms of masculinity. For example, we talked in a previous episode about the correlation between masculinity and violence. And while most men aren't violent, we continue to see the horrific consequences of gun violence and mass shootings in the US, predominantly perpetuated by men. What can we even do as men when we see these challenges and yet feel unable to affect change? I hope my next guest can share the insights he's gathered from his therapeutic work specializing in masculinity and trauma. Dr. William Elder is a clinical psychologist, researcher, and adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Medicine at San Antonio. And personally, he identifies as a gay man, as a psychologist, and as a lover. Due to his focus on trauma and therapy with men, my hunch is that he can help us understand what still needs our attention at both individual and cultural levels for us to more fully step into the new masculine. So let's welcome him in and find out what he's got to offer. Thanks for joining me, Will.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here to continue talking about some pretty topical things that are going on in our culture around masculinity, trauma, mental health conditions, gun violence. I think that from what I know of you, I think you might have a lot to offer to our conversation. So thanks for being here.
You're welcome. I appreciate your having this forum, and I appreciate the authenticity of your format.
Oh, thank you. So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, is there anything you'd like to share about yourself that will help people know who you are and why you're here to have this conversation?
Sure. Yeah. I think I started to think about masculinity from a very young age. I think, I think a lot of, as I've listened to other guests on your show and as I sat through a lot of researchers' sort of addresses and storytelling, I think that a commonality is that masculinity was something that was confusing. And that I think for everybody, there are parts of masculinity or our gender identity that we really love, and there are parts that we learn to live with, and there are parts that we hate. And I think that for many researchers in gender, maybe we have more parts that we hate or have had to learn to live with than other people. And something that I also love about studying gender is that everyone is already an expert in gender. And we may not have all the words to articulate our experiences or our observations, but if you go into a room of other people, even if you don't know those people, you all have the same ideas about what's expected. So anyway, I grew up in a rural community in Utah, and uh, among really kind-hearted people who tended to be indirect in communicating what they wanted and saying no, or a lot of inexpressiveness. I also found that the stuff that boys seemed to know did not come intuitively to me. And I may have shared that story with you, that I remember being back to school shopping and, probably first or second grade. And my mom ran into the mom of a boy in my class and said, and they greeted one another. And she said that her son only wanted ankle socks this year. And I was listening in the dressing room thinking, ankle socks, how does he know about ankle socks? How am I going to find out about these things? Where am I going to go for information about this? And I think too, if you're gay, there's an urgency to finding out this information because it allows you to stay out of trouble. It allows you to pass and to not face conflict and bullying and also kind of the vulnerability to shame that exists for children when they're criticized by their peers. And so, I think I always felt strangely inside, but also in moments outside of the circle where, where you imagine that masculinity is contained. You find out later that it's all an illusion anyway, but I felt like I was always a bit outside studying it, even though I was a boy and then am a man. Let's see. In high school, I started reparative therapy, and that was something that my parents actually had nothing to do with. I got a volunteer job at 16 working in a community crisis line and through the United Way, and learned to do 15-minute phone calls where you help people solve problems or manage thoughts of self-harm. And we had a lot of community resources, and one of those was a group and therapy for religious men who were gay but were in conflict about their identity. And so I took this phone number home one night after a shift and called it myself and started to go to therapy. It was on a sliding scale. So I was able to, as a 16-year-old, afford, my first therapy. And it was weekly group and weekly individual therapy, which I did from the time I was 16 to 19. And I told my parents after the first 6 months, because they knew I was going to therapy, but they didn't know why. And I would tell them, I remember the moment, like my mom came upstairs, and that was how I came out. She said, "Why are you going to therapy?" And I said, "Well, I'm gay." And she said, "Well, we knew that. Is there anything else?" And I said, "No." And she was like, "Oh God, I'm so glad you're not doing drugs." But I mean, there was more to that conversation than that. But part of the reason that I bring this up, and I want to point out that there's a lot of conflation, right, between sexual orientation and gender identity. For me, in those years, part of the intervention of the branch of, there seemed to be like a cluster of therapists in my area who kind of all followed the same orientation and had the same programming. They would host Saturday sports camps with the rationale that if you were able to interact with heterosexual men in these normative ways and were able to form friendships and intimate relationships, that you would no longer have sexual feelings for men. And that if you could somehow be normed appropriately and felt like you could use sports as a way to, forge these relationships, that it would fix you. So of course, I wasn't ever very good at it, but I would go because there was a lot riding on it too. So not only at this point was it about passing and about avoiding bullying and self-criticism, but it was also about salvation. And for me, that was very real. I don't think that, with all of the evolutions that we've had as a family and in our faith, I'm grateful to be able to say that my parents didn't have anything to do with why I went. I don't think they would have suggested it. But I felt so much urgency, also in part because I knew at 19 I would have to serve a mission for 2 years as part of the LDS faith. And then, get married and have children. And I wanted to stay in that community.
Can I jump in real quick and just, I'm just wanting to acknowledge the story you're sharing. It's a story I didn't know from your past around, as you were sharing, you said that there was the stuff that boys seem to know just intuitively that didn't come intuitively to you. And so when you're recognizing that there's this gap between what other boys know and what you don't know, you were sort of like, where do you go to find out that information? I heard you say that that's what your child's mind was trying to figure out. And when you grow up in a religious culture that tells you that sort of salvation is on the line, that puts this like fear and shame piece into it. And so in some ways, while my first reaction is judgment and a desire to like rush in and protect you as a person from needing to go through reparative therapy, it also makes sense to me that you were seeking and you were searching and that you were trying to find where that information was. And these people said, we have that information for you. So it's really powerful to recognize that how much is on the line for many of us as boys growing into men to fit into some sort of norm. And when we don't, the lengths at which we will go to in order to pass, to present, to stay connected to our communities, to not fall from grace in some ways. I just think it's a really powerful explanation of what pressure is put on us as men to be a certain version of men.
Gosh, I'd never made that connection for myself, that it was part of this searching for information. Certainly, of course, now I'm 42 and I'm still searching for this information. The first part, the most immediate part of my dissertation was interviewing straight men. And I was also going to interview gay men and bi men, but straight men were the men that I tackled first because they seemed the most mysterious and strange. And I'm just kind of sitting with and making meaning of that and sort of the career path that I took. So I took my first gender studies course at a religiously affiliated university, and it did not have a gender studies program, but they had one psych of gender class. And I had never found anything so fascinating. And
was this before or after you came out?
Before.
Okay.
So I came home from my LDS mission and I went to Brigham Young University. and began studying psychology and took the Psych of Gender class, and then transferred to the University of Utah, which had a gender studies department, and then double majored in psychology and gender studies. And psychology was this huge degree program, and it felt very quantitative and in many ways very masculine kind of system of epistemology. And I didn't ever really make any deep connections with other students. And I didn't feel a deep sense of connection with the material, although I found it interesting. But when I started to take gender studies classes, I found everything that I felt I was hoping to find, these in-depth conversations in small groups and psychoeducation, this vulnerability, this positionality, this, not that everything personal would be shared, but that there were disclosures that would get academic conversations to places that they would not otherwise arrive. And I think that's sort of also been a theme for me about masculinity, and a commitment that I made, probably, I don't know, at the beginning of my career, that I would be as radically open as a person as was professionally appropriate, because I think it's a pretty fantastic revolutionary act to be a man, explaining the impact of his relationships in life, experiences on himself. I think this is what you're doing also here at this podcast. I was really drawn to your request that people disclose their horizons of understanding. It seems much more honest to say, I'm going to probably look at my life experiences and the data that I've generated through research through this lens. And so I'm going to disclose that from the beginning, so you'll know in which way I'm going to skew, so that you can kind of maybe compensate a little bit. But
hell, I'm not going to compensate. I'm biased too. We all have our biases, and I think the audience at this point is pretty clear on what my biases are. And I appreciate you for making that decision as a professional to be sort of that radically open, that you balance your professional identity with the man, the human that's there, because it's a similar commitment that I've made to myself in the work that I do is that I'm not always perfect at it or good at it, but I do venture to be a whole human being in my relationships with my clients, in my relationships with my friends and my family. Like, I don't want to just section myself off into one part of my identity, one element of things. I think oftentimes that rigidity of masculinity often asks us to be in sort of little sections of ourselves, small archetypes of the whole human experience. And so I completely agree with you that it is radical to be into it. It's transformative for you to show up as a man that commits to that, because then it gives permission for other men to do that too. Doesn't force them to, but it gives them permission to, at least.
I agree. I'm curious for you, because this is true for me. Have you linked kind of your years of not being able to say the truth about yourself to this very irksome sense of discomfort when you're in a situation and you can't speak the truth or be all of yourself at one time?
Yeah, it's like at one point, each one of us as gay men have decided that we were going to share the scariest thing. and be radically honest about ourselves. And so I definitely have resistance to those moments where when I feel like I have to go back into the closet about any of my beliefs or thoughts or values. Like, for sure, like I already broke through that, and it can be really triggering. And I think that's kind of part of like maybe almost like an attachment style, or like something that's like locked into the nervous system a bit more. It's not just cognitively there. There's a part of my identity that has worked so hard to move over that hurdle, and to have to feel like I'm taking a step back can be really, I think, a little even more for me than irksome.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, and I think gender has everything to do with that. That it's also back to this time of trying to conform to this thing that ultimately made you very unhappy and was very unhealthy. And I equate inexpressiveness and restriction and anti-femininity and heterosexuality and trying to pass as heterosexual with all of this, unhappiness and depression.
Something you shared with me, and it's something I really connect with, that I'd love to pull you out on, is that you and I both still notice patterns within ourselves where we still are playing that masculinity game. And you wrote to me that you have sometimes reward yourself for performing masculinely, and you are hard on yourself when you don't. I have that so much. Like I haven't not figured out how to reconcile that. Like, it's the focus of my work. It's what I'm really out there doing. And I still keep finding layers where I buy into that system that I don't really value and believe in anymore. Tell me about your relationship to that.
On our birthdays every year, my husband and I set a goal for the year. And my goal this year is to not feel shame about my desire to connect with other people. And kind of more broadly, to not feel ashamed of myself. And I notice that the moments that I feel the most shame are those moments when I cross those boundaries and I am acting in ways that seem non-masculine, even though, who better to know that these are unhealthy norms than someone who studies and is fascinated by these unhealthy norms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I do feel like, and so maybe the answer is to accept that I do have these residual moments where, when I say no in a meeting, I don't have time to do this thing, I kind of pat myself on the back. Or when I calm someone who's upset, or I seem like the calm one in a situation, or there's some masculinity, I think, associated with being at the PTSD clinic at the VA. Even though I'm the only man in the clinic, you go and hear these stories all day long about horrific events. And, I think probably one of the things that drew me to trauma was that it was so hardcore, that it was like, oh, bro, that's so hard. Like, wow, how do you handle hearing all that stuff all day long? And to be able to say, it's no thing, to pretend as though it's effortless, like someone who's like dunked a basketball or run a marathon, and they're like, oh, I'm just built for this, whereas, really it does take a lot of work.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's so interesting how we've equated as a culture like that stoicism or unaffectedness as masculine. It's like, what? You're unaffected by anything and that's what's masculine? That's like vacancy. That's not masculine.
That's a really important point. I mean, how much of masculinity is dissociation?
Dissociation.
Yes.
Yeah. It's
that
powerful.
it's about not being present. It's kind of having this waxy film over your ability to feel things.
Mm.
And um and pretending like other people don't matter, and pretending that you're not hurt. So I I really wrestled with coming out. Didn't do that until my late 20s. And I mean, can you imagine going through an entire gender studies degree and never coming out? I mean, I was probably, I mean, I'm sure I was, I don't know, who knows if I was the only closeted person in the gender studies department, but I was there, and I was. And I'm sure I was working. I mean, of course, education is therapy in many ways, and I was still trying to figure out myself, and um, working that out in my mind.
Yeah, I get that, because I went through most of my MSW program without coming out. It wasn't until the last semester, and it was coming face to face with an ethical issue around being given a client as a behavior coach for kids who was an LGBT person who was also LDS and was trying to kill himself because he couldn't reconcile the difference. One would argue that's too much for an intern to be working with, and I knew that, and so I had to kind of seek some supervision that could support me. But it really pushed me into a place of like, I can't reconcile this for myself. How am I going to support this person? And so I feel you. I can be like, how did I even have the chutzpah to like get in there and to go through most of a program that's about helping give people resources and support people to transform their lives and not be able to do it for myself.
This is a really important theme for me too. At one point, when I went to grad school too, I went to a religious institution. And again, I mean, I think that there's a part of being at a religious institution that was about also really enjoying spirituality and reflecting on my values. And I think at a religious institution, you do end up kind of doing a lot of disclosure about meaning. And for some reason, that just continued to draw me. But at any rate, it was being there initially. My first year of graduate school, I really underestimated that you were becoming an instrument, and that in order to become an instrument, where you're teaching your gut to be your DSM, and you're kind of looking at your identities, and really our identities are our strengths as clinicians and as researchers. If you're not going to be in a position to value those things and use them, you're not going to do it with great efficacy. And so I switched universities again so that I could be at a public university where I could integrate my identity. And that's actually when I came out, is when I went to graduate school at another university. Tell me, so this impetus.
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm so here for how you described that that grad school really trains you to be the instrument of your profession. I am so here for that. Thank you for putting language to that thing. It just resonates with me that how often we, especially in the helping professions, we might need to section parts of ourselves off in order to either cope with what we're passively taking on, or we section ourselves off because we are trying to be the vacant space for our clients. And that's just not my value system as a professional. So I just appreciate the way that you put that and totally resonate with it.
Oh, I'm glad you feel that. I'm glad. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I mean, I teach, young therapists to gauge what the pathology was by how tired they are, by what they felt themselves doing in the session. Did it feel like typical, did it feel like a typical amount of energy that you would spend on a situation with someone with PTSD, or did it feel more than that? Did you feel a lot of disapproval about being a couple of minutes late or not returning a phone call? How much disapproval did you feel? How angry were they that they had switched therapists before? How upset were they that they would have to wait? I mean, did they do 3 pieces of homework or did they do 6 pieces of homework? That there are parts of yourself that tell you what's going on, and I think when you're in a situation where you start to value that information and your ability to pull from that information, I think you finally have the ability to build the rapport necessary to get people to do scary shit.
I think that's such a reparative, not in the reparative therapy kind of way, but in the
corrective.
It's a corrective experience for, I think, could be for all men, but I think especially as queer men, we're taught not to trust ourselves for a long time by our culture and to not listen to those things and to go into it and start to redevelop a relationship to what's just authentically coming through me as I sit here in this experience can be such a powerful corrective experience to the many years of not doing that. And it can be difficult sometimes. I find sometimes just trusting my own voice when I'm writing a piece for a blog or when I'm writing a piece for social media that's about the work that I do, I find myself wanting to judge what's natural for me, who I authentically am, and try to push that away and then create another presentation. It's like, wow, how quickly the mask goes back on. I've spent my life my adult life trying to take the mask off, and yet it just pops right back on.
And what we know about racial ethnic minorities, conformity to norms and masculine gender norms is that when we're in stressful situations, we conform most to norms, and that we want to be less risk-taking. And I think that there's a lot to standing in places where people are more formal and being yourself. What I'm also saying here is you should be yourself, and that doesn't mean that you should always choose a place where that's easy, which is not what you imply. But also, even if you're doing a presentation for, in front of a big academic audience, you should, find joy in being yourself and have that excitement of sharing something you really feel than having the PowerPoint presentation with the charts and graphs. Mm. Are you struck sometimes by how little you know about yourself and this process of having grown up for so many years, pretending that you didn't know things about yourself? There are moments where I discover little things about myself that I just feel like I'm only scratching the surface of, like, being able to admit to myself all the things that I really know about who I am. Does that make sense?
For sure. Yeah. It's almost like meeting a stranger over and over again sometimes. Yeah, I think I can really connect with that. I went through a phase, I'm not feeling it as intensely over the last couple of months, but I was in a pretty significant phase where I was really reflecting on my relational style, like how I relate to others, how I show up in relationships. And I hit that sort of place of where I'd recognize that so much of my relational style tended to be coping in the relationship rather than actually being in the relationship. And learning, like, it was disorienting to be in this place of, like, I don't even know what authentically is me. I've been practicing that version so long that how do I really want to connect? And when I want to let some of that go because it's not serving me and not getting me where I want to get to, it can feel scary and unsafe because those coping strategies were developed for a reason. And yet my nervous system doesn't quite know yet that I'm a grown man that can make new choices that are informed by my now perspective, my nervous system still wants to go into that scared little boy that needs to protect himself.
I find too that for me, some moments of clarity come in those relationships, and people that I love and care about will teach me new things about myself. And they will say, by the way, did you know that you do this? I have a close friend who recently taught me that when she asks a question that I'm uncomfortable answering, I somehow will lose it in a thread of text. And since she's brought it up to me, when she initially said it to me, I thought, no, there's no way that I could have done that. I always answer every question, but now I notice that I do that. And that's also an important part of masculinity, I think, is being able to be taught new things about yourself and new things about the world, and responding with humility and saying, thank you so much for teaching that about myself. I lack awareness about that. I haven't always curious about knowing how I can be a better man, a better person. And I am now, and I can handle hearing that. And that's a gift so that I can avoid future foibles, and that it's sort of an act of caring. I think that's something that I've learned living in the South and living near the border, and being married to someone, who is Latinx, that I think it's a lot more common in Latin culture to be able to give that kind of direct feedback as an act of caring, rather than, glossing over difficulties as a way of showing love.
Gosh, that's such a good point. How many of our families have taught us those patterns really well, to just gloss over those things and that's a sign of respect and love. And yet, that when we can remain curious in moments and learn more and learn to bend and learn about ourselves more, rather than being in those rigid and brittle kind of moments. I think that's a theme that has come up with so many of the guests on this podcast, is that curiosity. We're all learning to be more curious in our relationship to self, and our relationships with others, and the ways that we engage in the world, the way that we, the sort of curiosity about the difference between our intention that we bring into the world and the impact we actually have. Sometimes there's a gap between, I had good intentions, but I had a crappy impact on somebody. How do we stay curious in those moments when our ego wants to defend and get rigid and lock up a little bit? I love that you're bringing that up, because it is a pretty consistent theme that I think most of us who are talking on this podcast are really starting to reflect on curiosity being a part of the new masculine, something we want to bring with us into the new, rather than the lack of curiosity that many of us were kind of taught about ourselves.
I think, going back to childhood, one of the most perplexing things for me when I was growing up was trying to make connections with other men, and realizing that men are more likely to disclose when you are side to side with them rather than facing them directly. And that this curiosity manifests itself in such an interesting, indirect way. When I was growing up, I asked a lot of questions, and that's still my style today. If I'm interested in someone, I tell me more, tell me about this, what about this? And I find that men can sometimes express curiosity by just spontaneously telling you a story and then waiting for you to match the disclosure. And that's incredibly frustrating for me because I want more information, and I want it specific, and I want it now. But growing up, I tried to wait and let boys my age tell me things. And I think I stopped. I mean, of course, maybe that's why I became a psychologist. Maybe it gave me permission to ask all of my direct questions without feeling so shameful about it.
Yeah. I feel that way too as a coach. It's like, okay, you've already paid me and given me consent to ask the questions I want to ask. I don't have to hold back and go indirectly and go that slowly. I can still show up with respect and boundaries on what this person needs, but I also get permission to show up as a person with my curiosity. So I totally feel that too. I really want to pull you out on one more thing on a personal level before we talk even more about your professional experience. So you went through this part of this young child that didn't understand intuitively what other boys knew. You did some seeking. You went through different types of therapy as a way of trying to stay connected to your community and to a sense of salvation that was taught to you. How were you able to reconcile those pieces around salvation and community importance to take the next step in your own personal journey of coming out and moving into more authenticity and away from what you were trying to perform?
It's a great question. This is a really good question. And I appreciate you've had some good practice formulating questions.
Wink.
And this is probably why men don't like direct questions.
We've hit that moment. Okay, let's. Nobody else will be able to see us, but let's turn side to side, shoulder to shoulder. Let's not look at each other directly.
I think that's bullshit. Wow, I'm really turning red.
Share what feels safe. It's okay. You don't have to go all the way in.
Okay. Well, I mean, it took a long time. It took a lot of emotional processing, right? I mean, that's what we know works in trauma therapy is if you don't talk about it and you put a box around it and you put it on a shelf, then it will stay in control of your life. And if you talk about it with your mom and you talk about it with your friend and you talk about it with yourself and you write about it and go to therapy about it and you examine it until you're exhausted and you have no interest in it anymore, eventually you come to peace with the fact that you still feel as assured of your values and your goodness outside of a religious organization as you did when you were in it. And I know that that's something that many listeners, I'm sure, would argue isn't true. But I thought that if I walked away, I would be cut off from joy and well-being, and that isn't what happened. I didn't have the experience that I hope many gay men are having now in their 20s as they leave religious affiliation and they have church members who reach out to them and say, hey, I'm your friend. Hey, I believe that, you're a good person. I formed another community. But that community was every bit as well. I mean, it was so much more valuable to me because people knew me as I really was, and they saw that my authenticity was an invitation to be close to me, and they valued that. And it became lasting. I didn't know it back then, but when my identity was false, I couldn't have lasting relationships. When my identity became real, I could have friendships that were going to last, and romantic relationships that were going to last, and relationships with patients that were going to be profound. And I think that there are some commonalities here between sexual orientation, identity, and gender in that way. That, as your notions of masculinity expand, and you see that there's this whole salad bar more of personality characteristics that you can put on your plate. You know, you just enjoy relationships, I think, a lot more. Your capacity to be vulnerable and to love and to connect increases.
Yeah, I actually love what can happen in a heterosexual male and gay male friendship around these pieces when a heterosexual man is willing to be curious about the journey that a gay man has been through, because there are some similarities, and we had to sort of break through some cultural norms to be authentically ourselves. And as men are considering breaking sort of gender role norms or masculinity norms in order to be more authentically themselves, there's a lot to be learned from those who have already walked through some of that journey and who have moved through it. Doesn't mean that means you as a heterosexual man become gay, or you become like very effeminate, or that you like that you become somebody different than you are. It just means you tap into something authentic. My version of, as a gay man, my version of authentic masculinity is still going to be different than other men's, and that allowing space for the differences, but curiosity about what each other's learned in each other's journeys can be so transformative and healing.
I think I shared with you that the first time I ever came out to a group of heterosexual men was going to an American Psychological Association Division 51 event for the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinities. And
had many of those men on this podcast.
Yes, you have. And it was such a transformative experience. I don't know if heterosexual men are aware of how powerful that attention, that interest can be. I mean, I still get so nervous around heterosexual men for fear that they're going to think that I am going to sexualize something about them, when truly that's like, I'm a boring old man who's married, just like any other boring old man who's married. And I don't have the time or energy. but it's like, to feel validated for being outside of masculinity by someone who has so much privilege in masculinity. Gosh, it's I don't know how to describe that feeling. How would you describe that feeling?
What I know is that the energy flows both ways, and so there's like this healing element for the queer man in the relationship, to have somebody see them and be curious about them, and to work on some of those masculinity wounds that we've had from our childhoods. But then also there's this permission to get curious and to access more parts of themselves that happens for the heterosexual identifying man. Like that there's this flow of energy that can be really transformative for both, and really intimate, non-sexual intimacy that can be really powerful to sit in. And I have dreams of at some point putting together workshops where men of different sexual orientation identities can be in the same spaces and curious about each other and each other's journeys, and to watch what can happen in that. Because my heterosexual male friendships have been some of the most transformative ones that I've had in my own personal journey.
Gary Brooks, who founded Vision 51, was my advisor, and was the first heterosexual man who knew I was gay and valued that about me, and saw that identity as unique and needed, and an exciting point of view for the subject that he was so passionate about. He said to me once, there isn't anything about you, Will, that could create an offensive comment. And I still think about that today, as I have lots of moments of doubts before presentations that I've decided to not, that I've decided to be authentic about. And you know, that's been my entire experience of Division 51. It really is an amazing collection of human beings. um, I think that it's a study of gender.
Hmm.
um, I think that it's about masculinity, but I think that even more overarchingly, it's about relationships to power.
Hmm.
It's a group of people who want to understand how access to resources affects mental health, and particularly gendered resources or
Hmm.
gendered types of power.
Hmm. So tell me about a little bit about your research and what you're putting your focus on these days as a member of Division 51, as a therapist and psychologist, as somebody who works at the VA who's focused on trauma. Like, where do you find your interest going these days about where we can best support men in making changes in their lives?
You know, in the last couple of years, I've been fascinated about how masculinity can manifest itself as a symptom of trauma, and in particular of avoidance. That men can really perform these norms of way of avoiding difficult feelings and situations that remind them of vulnerability, and that they might have sex as a way of avoiding vulnerability, but allowing themselves to connect in some ways that they may not allow themselves to have kind of vulnerable, making love, sensual experiences with their partner, but rather than disclose their inner world, they may have this emotionally disconnected version of a relationship. Um, this protective role over one's family, I think, uh, masks the kind of hypervigilance part of PTSD. Um, a lot of one's negative, rigid thoughts are around not being able to trust people, always needing to be in the ready for a dangerous situation to happen, not wanting to be close to people, not valuing other people. And I think that there's this gendered part of PTSD for men that has to be addressed. David Lisak wrote about this conflict that men experience in trauma therapy. They're in the vice grip between the neurobiology of trauma, which makes them hypersensitive to danger and sends them into fight, flight, or freeze, and then masculine norms, which from the beginning ask men to not seek help. And from the moment that a man comes into therapy, he's beginning to bend and break that part of the vice grip, because the neurobiology part cannot change until the masculinity norm is bent. And I think that that's a great metaphor for psychotherapy in general, that as men are butting up against these symptoms, that in order to even come into the room, in order to develop the rapport necessary with you, they're going to have to start to change their notions of masculinity. And so I think it's just an inherent part of every therapy relationship, even beyond the context of trauma. I think another thing that I'm really becoming fascinated by is the self-reliance element of masculinity. Previously I've been really fascinated by kind of the heteromasculinity element and by the emotional inexpressiveness element. But I think that more and more research is headed in the direction that it's this exaggerated independence that may actually get in the way. I'm not going to say the most, but significantly. And I think a lot of what we used to think of as being the fault of emotional restrictiveness isn't necessarily just emotional inexpressiveness. It's what you intend when you express emotion. Because I can be in a room with a man who says 10 words, but wants to connect with me and is willing to let me help him, versus a man who says, a half hour worth of, insight about his emotion, but isn't willing to connect with me. And I think that I'm starting to think more critically about how to create moments in therapy where men have to be vulnerable in relationships and allow other people to help them. The article that I published last month in Psychological Trauma is about incorporating one's spouse into PTSD therapy. And there's a long history of psychoeducation groups for PTSD being used in VA and elsewhere, providing information about symptoms and about kind of how these affect family relationships. And there really isn't any outcome that those groups create lasting change in PTSD symptoms. But I started a group a couple of years ago using, it's a group of couples. The model is called the multifamily group model, and presenting the same psychoed content, but just inviting a spouse along creates change. And I think that it's, then you can argue, well, is it really actually psychoed? Because probably what you're doing is creating an emotional exposure, that men are actually having to disclose and talk. But there's also this really fascinating thing. There's this intertwining between PTSD symptoms and relationship dissatisfaction. What gets you caught in PTSD, those that experience trauma and develop PTSD, are emotionally avoidant. Candace Monson calls PTSD emotion phobia. And that's the number one thing that couples come into therapy for: lack of communication, lack of emotional disclosure. And when you undo one, you tend to undo the other. When a man or a woman starts to talk about their traumatic events, start to talk about their emotions, of course, their spouse also feels closer to them. And they seem to just happen, fantastically at the same time, that you can improve family relationships at the same time as you can undo PTSD. So anyway, I think that accessing relationships, building exposures or at-home practice assignments that involve vulnerability and talking and awareness of one's own thoughts and feelings and experiencing those with other people can have this additional compounding effect to making beneficial outcome for people in the treatment.
Sounds like what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, but it sounds like what you're saying to me is that therapeutic interventions are really powerful, but one of the things you find to be an amplifier or to be something that really facilitates change is connection. And both emotional connection to self, connection to other people. And so much of our training as men has been to disconnect and to avoid connection and to undervalue connection. And so in some ways, it's about providing corrective experiences of reconnection. And that in itself is just as much of a therapeutic intervention as cognitive behavioral therapy or DBT or any of the other sort of modalities that you might go into, that just connection in itself can be reparative.
I agree. And we're better to have it occur than within the session and then deliberately processing what it feels like to grow this connection and what creates connection, and then behaviorally rehearsing the steps of that connection with you as a safe person, and then recreating those things outside and scaffolding those experiences, so that they, someone might start practicing asking someone that they care about their day. or
Uh-huh.
start a conversation about two things you're grateful for that day. That never goes wrong, right? And then you
Uh-huh.
might build, and then you build up to something a little bit more like talking about the logistics of a week, or talking about childcare or house repairs, and then building up to, you know, this is how these are my values, these are my goals, this is what I want, this is when I'm hurt, this is when I feel romantic,
Hmm.
this is what it feels like to me to be loved, this is the thing that you do to make that feeling occur in me. um, that's a really great point. I hadn't thought about that. that
Uh,
that yeah, that creating connection can in and of itself be a therapeutic intervention.
Yeah. And I do agree with you that like a therapeutic relationship or a coaching relationship can be really powerful, because not only can you be in a relationship and in a connection in that therapeutic relationship, but you can also do the process of talking about the relationship. You can like here's what just created connection for me, and you can like almost talk about the process of the relationship just as much as you can be in the relationship in a safe way, because you've got the therapist or the coach there as the facilitator. Oftentimes in our personal relationships we kind of just get lost in the dynamic, but what happens when you can kind of pop up above the dynamic, look at it, talk about it, analyze it, reflect on it, try something new in a safe container? I think that is a really powerful place. And that's why I always recommend that men have a tendency, if they're going to do their work, to want to do it on their own. But there's so much power once you bring it into a relationship. Once you bring in another person into it, it amplifies it. And then more people get involved. And then it just keeps amplifying and getting bigger. There's only so much of our work we can do as individuals. We need to learn co-regulation. We need to learn how to be with each other. We need to learn how to disagree and still see each other's humanity. Like there's just so much to learn when we can do it in the context of a relationship.
So this is like the oppositional, the part of me that has to say the unsaid thing, which maybe is a gay thing, and maybe that's a strength that we bring into our clinical work, but also to kind of bring in the meta. What has this podcast taught you about your own masculinity?
I think one of the biggest things that I have found in this process is that I'm just as much kind of discussing, reflecting on, analyzing the outside world as I am my inner world. Like this feels just as much to me as about the change I want to see in the outside world as it is about my own healing journey, my
Hmm.
own willingness to take up space. Like even just listening to myself when I edit the podcast, I listen to the way that I speak. And sometimes I'm saying a statement, and at the end of a statement, my voice goes up as if it's a question. And there's almost this like still there's this place inside of me that's still asking for permission to have a perspective, to to make a solid statement about what I believe. And it doesn't happen all the time, but I hear moments where I do this little like upturned thing that is about making sure that the person that I'm talking with agrees with me, or looking for a social cue if we're okay. And so I still see those places where I'm actually sometimes afraid to step into my masculine energy, places where I soften as a way of taking care of the relationship instead of leaning in and being an equal with someone, and showing up fully with someone, and allowing somebody to see me and my perspectives and my values. So I still see it as much about me as it is about this thing I'm reflecting on out there.
You can see, I mean, in some ways, it sounds like this has been a scary process, but one that also has grown your own confidence.
Absolutely. Hugely.
Something that we talked about earlier that was unlike any conversation I've ever had before was talking about how using our gender identities as clinical strengths. And I think I talked to you a little bit about, when I began graduate school, I was so nervous about whether or not I was going to come out to my patients or whether or not I would be able to be out in the workplace. And I, gosh, this was like 2005, and I looked for anything that I could find about the decision to come out to one's patients. I found one dissertation, but there weren't any other articles. Now, of course, there are a lot of articles, and I've been surprised that it didn't end up being the conflict that I anticipated it would be back at the beginning of graduate school, and that even meaning patients would be so much, more accepting and would care so little about that, or seemingly, and in the workplace as well. But that there were parts of me being gay, or parts of me being more feminine, that I think allow men to open up sometimes, because I don't seem like competition, or I don't seem threatening, or I seem like I may have more information than other men about relationships, because of the stereotypes about femininity, and for 5 years, I was the sexual trauma coordinator at my hospital. I was the first man to be a sexual trauma coordinator at my hospital. And I think that the only a thing that helped me to stand in that space was that my own gender identity, I don't think, is stereotypical. And anyway, what I'm saying is there's power outside of those norms, and being able to step into a non-traditional gender identity can allow you to touch and reach people in a way that I didn't anticipate.
I totally agree. Yeah, I think there are certain men that my sexuality creates a boundary for them, or that it's a barrier to working with me, and that's okay. But what I find is the men that choose to work with me, I have more credibility with them because of my sexuality, because I don't perform in the same masculine norm ways. I have some sort of credibility in their eyes to learn something they don't already know, to learn something they haven't been performing their whole time, to learn something new. So completely agree with you. And what a corrective experience that is for the two gay boys who learned to perform for so long and be inauthentic, that it is our authenticity that gives us credibility and allows us to move into deeper work with men.
I mean, what's more courageous than being outside of this norm that's so scary? That is the thing that you do in order to have social and political and economic power. If you can stick up your middle finger and say, I don't need that, that's a pretty courageous thing, And
we often associate courage with masculinity. And so it's like, what a masculine thing to do, to be able to stand in your own identity without needing the world to give you approval in that, to just be in it.
Months ago, my husband and I took some dance classes, and at like a studio that is not a gay studio, it's for everybody, but we were the only gay couple. And my husband danced the follow position, and we live in San Antonio, which is nicknamed Military City, USA. It has a number of Air Force and Army installations, and we were with a lot of former military guys and current military guys. And my husband, in a group class, you like dance with every partner and you just go down the line. And I don't think I have ever seen anything, well, many things more courageous than my husband being willing to dance with these traditional men and say hello to every one of them. And I'm guessing be the first man that they had ever danced with, and to be self-faced, to be charming enough to pull it off.
That's so wild. As you're telling this story, I'm like, what? Feeling my own nervous system react to that. And like, I'm like, could I ever be that brave? That is so brave to be able to do.
It was pretty cool. Yeah.
Well, Will, I've had such a great time chatting with you. I feel like we could talk for a long time and we could go in a lot of different directions. There's so much I loved about our conversation and believe there's so much more to uncover. But I just thank you for taking the time to connect with me in that space, like to be two gay men that are facilitating work, that are working with men that are sometimes in our own sort of like professional identities, but to take time to really connect with another guy and be curious about each other. I've loved when you've had moments of asking me questions in this conversation, because it is a real connection at that point. So thank you for taking the time to be here. If people wanted to find out more about your work, to find out how they could access your therapy services, how they can find you in the world, how might they do so?
I have a website. It's sugarvalleytherapy.com. Sugar Valley was the name of the small town in East Texas where my grandfather had a ranch I went to growing up and have great memories about. So anyway, and my email address is william.elder@utah.edu.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure those are in the show notes too, so that people can easily access them. If people want to get in connection with me, you can go to my website at travisstock.com. You can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at traver03. It's a little bit of my personal life, but also the work that I'm doing here with The New Masculine. So if you're interested in participating in ongoing conversations about The New Masculine, please find me on Instagram. I'm also on Patreon. If you want to contribute to the mission of The New Masculine, you can go to patreon.com/The New Masculine. Again, that's patreon.com/The New Masculine. Thank you again, William, so much for offering you as a human being, but you as a professional as well. It's been a real delight to connect with you today.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for holding space for these kinds of conversations.
Well, it's my pleasure.